The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight helmet one final time. The leather was worn from countless missions, but it fit her head perfectly after 3 years of combat flying. Around her, the sounds of war preparation filled the air, mechanics shouting orders, engines roaring to life, and the distant rumble of artillery that never seemed to stop. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 18 months now, longer than most pilots lasted in this theater. She had seen friends shot down, watched good men disappear into the clouds never to return, and felt the cold grip of fear more times than she cared to remember. But she was still here, still flying, still fighting. The briefing room was thick with cigarette smoke when she entered. 22 pilots sat in metal folding chairs, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed anxiety. At the front of the room, Colonel Harrison stood before a large map covered in red marks and arrows. His weathered face showed the strain of commanding men who flew into death every day. "Gentlemen," he began, then caught himself and nodded towards Sarah. "And lady, today's mission is unlike anything we've attempted before. Intelligence reports indicate that the enemy has positioned their largest armored column along the Kasserine Valley. 35 tanks, plus support vehicles, supply trucks, and approximately 200 infantry." The room fell silent, except for the scratching of pencils on paper as pilots took notes. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. 35 tanks was more armor than their entire squadron had faced in their last 10 missions combined. "The column is moving through a narrow pass between two hills," Colonel Harrison continued, pointing to the map with his wooden pointer. "They believe they're safe from air attack because of the terrain. The pass is only wide enough for single-file movement, and the hills provide natural protection from conventional bombing runs." Lieutenant Baker, a young pilot from Oklahoma, raised his hand. "Sir, what about the flak? Intel shows they've got anti-aircraft guns positioned on both hills." "That's correct, Baker. Which brings me to the heart of this mission. High Command believes this column is impossible to stop with conventional air attack. The terrain is too difficult, the defense is too strong, and the target too well protected." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. She had heard this kind of talk before. When command said something was impossible, it usually meant they were about to ask someone to do it anyway. However, the colonel continued, "We've received new intelligence about a weakness in their formation. The tanks must move single file through the narrowest part of the pass. For approximately 3 miles, they'll be strung out like beads on a string, unable to maneuver or provide mutual support." The room buzzed with quiet conversation as pilots discussed the implications. Sarah remained silent, studying the map and calculating distances, angles, and timing. Her mind worked through the problem like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. "The mission is a single aircraft attack," Colonel Harrison announced. The room fell dead silent. One pilot, one plane, maximum stealth, and surprise. Get in fast, hit them hard, and get out before their defenses can respond effectively. Captain Reynolds, the squadron's most experienced pilot with over 40 missions, stood up. "Sir, with all due respect, that's suicide. Even if someone could get through the flak, 35 tanks is too many targets for one aircraft. The ammunition load alone." "Which is why," the colonel interrupted, "this mission is entirely voluntary. I'm not ordering anyone to fly this. I'm asking if anyone thinks they can do it." The room erupted in discussion. Voices rose as pilots debated the feasibility, the risks, and the slim chances of success. Sarah listened to their arguments, their concerns, their fear. They were all valid points. The mission was dangerous beyond measure. The chances of survival were minimal. Any rational pilot would decline. But Sarah wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about the intelligence reports she had read the night before. The enemy column wasn't just moving through the pass for tactical reasons. They were heading toward the town of San Pietro, where 3,000 civilians had been unable to evacuate. If those tanks reached the town, it wouldn't be a military engagement. It would be a massacre. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the one from her younger brother Tommy, who was somewhere in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. In his last letter, he had written about duty, about doing what needed to be done even when the odds were impossible. He had written about the Marines on some island she couldn't pronounce who had charged machine gun nests knowing they probably wouldn't survive, but doing it anyway because their comrades were counting on them. Sarah stood up slowly. The room gradually quieted as pilots noticed her movement. "I'll take the mission," she said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Mitchell, I appreciate your courage, but I must ask you to consider the implications. This isn't like your previous missions. The enemy is expecting an attack. They're prepared. The odds of success are minimal," Sarah finished for him. "I understand, sir. But if we don't stop that column, San Pietro falls. 3,000 civilians die. Sometimes the odds don't matter." Lieutenant Baker shook his head. "Sarah, you're a damn good pilot, but you're not a magician. 35 tanks? That's impossible." Sarah turned to face her fellow pilots. These men had become her family over the past months. They had celebrated her victories and mourned her losses. They respected her skill and trusted her judgment. Now, they were looking at her like she had lost her mind. "Maybe it is impossible," she said quietly. "But I've been studying those intelligence reports all night. I think I see something that everyone else is missing." She walked to the front of the room and pointed to the map. "Look at the terrain again. The pass isn't just narrow, it's also winding. The tanks can't see more than a few hundred yards in either direction. If I come in from the north, flying low through this valley here, I can approach from their blind spot." Colonel Harrison studied the map more carefully. "The mountains on that approach are over 8,000 feet. You'd have to fly between the peaks in weather that changes by the minute. One wrong turn. I know the risks, sir, but I also know my aircraft. I've been flying the P-47 longer than anyone in the squadron. I know exactly what she can do." Captain Reynolds stood up again. "Even if you get through their air defenses, even if you surprise them, how do you expect to destroy 35 tanks with one load of ammunition?" Sarah had anticipated this question. She had spent hours working through the tactical problem, considering every angle and possibility. "Fuel," she said simply. "I won't be attacking the tanks directly. I'll be attacking their fuel trucks." Understanding dawned on several faces around the room. The enemy column would need fuel trucks to support their advance. Those trucks would be loaded with thousands of gallons of gasoline and diesel fuel. In a narrow pass with limited maneuver room, a fuel truck explosion would set off a chain reaction, Lieutenant Baker said slowly. "If the trucks are positioned in the middle of the column." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "I don't need to destroy every tank individually. I need to create chaos, block their movement, and force them to abandon the advance." Colonel Harrison walked closer to the map, studying the terrain features and the marked positions of enemy forces. Sarah could see him weighing the possibilities, considering the risks against the potential benefits. "It's still incredibly dangerous," he said finally. "Even if your plan works, you'd be flying into a hornet's nest. Once you attack, every gun in that column will be shooting at you." "Yes, sir. But by then, I'll already be heading home." The room fell silent again as everyone contemplated the mission. Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes, the concern for her safety, and the professional respect for what she was proposing to attempt. Finally, Colonel Harrison made his decision. "Captain Mitchell, if you're determined to fly this mission, then we'll give you every possible advantage. I want you to choose your aircraft personally. Check every system twice. Take whatever ammunition load you think gives you the best chance." "Thank you, sir. There's one more thing," the colonel added. "This mission launches at 0500 hours tomorrow. That give you today to prepare and one night to think it over. If you change your mind, no one will think less of you." Sarah nodded and gathered her maps and notes. As she headed toward the door, Captain Reynolds called out to her. "Sarah, wait." She turned back to face him. Reynolds was a good man and an excellent pilot. His opinion mattered to her. "I think you're crazy," he said with a slight smile. "But if anyone can pull this off, it's you. Just come back alive, okay?" "I intend to," she replied. As Sarah walked out of the briefing room and into the bright morning sunlight, she felt the weight of what she had just committed to doing. Tomorrow morning, she would climb into her P-47 Thunderbolt and attempt something that every tactical manual said was impossible. She would fly alone into the teeth of enemy defenses, attack an armored column that outgunned her by 1,000 to 1, and try to stop an advance that could cost thousands of innocent lives. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah spent hours with her crew chief, Master Sergeant Johnson, going over every inch of her aircraft. They checked the engine, tested the guns, examined the control surfaces, and verified that every system was functioning perfectly. "This old bird's been good to you so far," Johnson said as they finished their inspection. "She'll get you through tomorrow, too." Sarah ran her hand along the metal skin of the aircraft's fuselage. The P-47 was painted olive drab with invasion stripes, and her nose art showed a fierce eagle clutching lightning bolts in its talons. Below the eagle, someone had painted the name Thunder Girl in bold letters. "She's never let me down yet," Sarah agreed. As the sun set over the airfield, Sarah sat in the pilot's ready room writing letters. One to her parents in Kansas, one to her brother Tommy in the Pacific, and one to her best friend Mary back home. She didn't mention the specifics of tomorrow's mission, but she wrote about courage, duty, and the things that made life worth fighting for. That night, sleep came fitfully. Sarah dreamed of flying through mountain passes, of explosions and gunfire, of tanks burning in a narrow valley. She woke several times, her heart pounding and her sheets soaked with sweat. At 0430 hours, her alarm clock rang. It was time to prepare for the impossible mission. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp as Sarah walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid morning air, and frost covered the wings of the parked planes like a thin layer of crystal. The ground crew had already begun warming up Thunder Girl's engine, and the deep rumble of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 filled the silence of the sleeping airfield. Master Sergeant Johnson met her at the aircraft, his weathered face serious in the dim light of the portable work lamps. Behind him, 3 other mechanics finished their final checks, their movements precise and efficient despite the early hour. "Everything's perfect, Captain," Johnson reported. "Engines running smooth, all systems check out green, and we've loaded your special ammunition request. 850 caliber machine guns, all synchronized and test-fired. You got armor-piercing incendiary rounds, just like you asked for." Sarah nodded and began her pre-flight walk-around inspection. Even though Johnson and his crew had already checked everything twice, she examined every detail personally. The mission ahead would leave no room for mechanical failures or overlooked problems. The armament loading had been carefully planned. Instead of the standard mix of ammunition, Sarah had requested maximum armor-piercing incendiary rounds. These special bullets were designed to penetrate armor plating and then ignite whatever they hit. Against fuel trucks loaded with gasoline, they would be devastatingly effective. "Fuel load?" she asked. "Topped off completely," Johnson replied. "You've got maximum range, but that also means maximum weight for takeoff. The runway's going to feel shorter than usual." Sarah understood the trade-off. More fuel meant longer range and more time over the target area, but it also meant a heavier aircraft that would be slower to climb and harder to maneuver. In aerial combat, extra weight could mean the difference between life and death. Colonel Harrison approached the aircraft as Sarah completed her inspection. His face looked haggard in the harsh light, and she realized he probably hadn't slept much either. Leading men into dangerous missions never got easier, regardless of experience. "Final weather report," he said, handing her a sheet of paper. "Clouds are building over the mountains, but visibility should be acceptable until around 0800 hours. After that, fog and possible thunderstorms." Sarah scanned the weather data quickly. The timing would be critical. She needed to reach the target area before the weather deteriorated, complete her attack, and escape before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Intelligence update. Colonel Harrison continued. The enemy column began moving at 0400 hours. They're maintaining their predicted schedule, which puts them in the optimal attack zone at approximately 0630 hours. That gives me a 30-minute window, Sarah calculated. Plenty of time if everything goes according to plan. And if it doesn't, Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then I adapt and improvise, sir. That's what pilots do. The colonel extended his hand. Good luck, Captain Mitchell. Bring yourself and that aircraft home safely. I'll do my best, sir. As Colonel Harrison walked away, Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her startup procedures. The familiar routine of switches, gauges, and control checks helped calm her nerves and focus her mind on the technical aspects of flying. Each movement was automatic, burned in her muscle memory by hundreds of hours of training and combat experience. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, though not the prettiest fighter in the sky. It was big, heavy, and built like a tank. While other fighters prioritized speed and maneuverability, the P-47 was designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. Its massive engine could push the aircraft to over 400 miles per hour, and its 8 machine guns delivered firepower that could shred enemy aircraft or ground targets with equal effectiveness. Sarah had learned to love the Thunderbolt's reliability and toughness. She had brought damaged aircraft home on multiple occasions, limping back to base with holes in the wings and smoke trailing from the engine. The P-47's reputation for survivability had saved her life more than once. Tower, this is Thunder Girl requesting taxi clearance, she radioed. Thunder Girl, Tower, you're cleared to taxi. Wind is from the northwest at 8 knots. Runway is clear. Sarah advanced the throttle and felt the aircraft begin to move. The heavy fighter rolled slowly across the tarmac, past the other aircraft, and toward the active runway. In the distance, she could see the mountains that she would soon be flying through, their peaks barely visible against the dark sky. At the runway threshold, Sarah performed her final checks. Engine temperature normal, oil pressure good, control surfaces responding correctly. Everything looked perfect. She took a deep breath and keyed her radio. Tower, Thunder Girl ready for takeoff. Thunder Girl, you are cleared for takeoff. Good hunting, Captain. Sarah pushed the throttle to maximum power and released the brakes. The Thunderbolt surged forward, gaining speed rapidly as the powerful engine pulled the heavy fighter down the runway. At 120 miles per hour, she pulled back gently on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off the ground. The sensation of flight never got old. Despite all the missions, all the combat, all the fear and danger, Sarah still felt a thrill every time she left the ground. Up here, she was in complete control of a magnificent machine capable of incredible performance. The weight and worries of the ground fell away, replaced by the pure focus required for precision flying. She climbed steadily toward the mountains, following the route she had memorized the night before. The flight path would take her through a series of valleys and passes, staying below the peaks to avoid enemy radar detection. It was a dangerous route that required precise navigation and constant attention to terrain clearance. As she approached the first mountain pass, Sarah descended to just a few hundred feet above the valley floor. The rocky walls rose steeply on both sides, and she had to bank sharply to follow the winding course. At this altitude and speed, there was no margin for error. One moment of inattention could send her crashing into the mountainside. The morning light was growing stronger as she flew deeper into the mountains. Ahead, she could see the weather beginning to build, with dark clouds gathering around the higher peaks. She would need to complete her mission and escape before those clouds descended into the valleys and made flying impossible. After 20 minutes of careful navigation through the mountains, Sarah reached the final approach to the target area. According to her calculations, the enemy column should be entering the narrow pass right about now. She reduced power and began a careful descent toward the valley floor. The landscape below was rugged and unforgiving. Rocky hills covered with scrub brush stretched in all directions, broken by deep ravines and narrow valleys. In the distance, she could see the road that the enemy column was following a thin ribbon of dirt that snaked through the terrain like a brown scar. Sarah flew lower, using the terrain to mask her approach. The hills would hide her aircraft from enemy observers until the last possible moment. Speed and surprise were her only advantages against the overwhelming firepower waiting ahead. As she rounded the final hill before the target area, Sarah saw them. The enemy armored column stretched through the valley like a mechanical snake, exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted. 35 tanks moved single file through the narrow pass, accompanied by trucks, half-tracks, and support vehicles. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Each tank was a powerful war machine capable of devastating firepower. Together, they represented enough combat power to destroy an entire town or break through any defensive line. And she was going to attack them alone. Sarah studied the column layout as she approached. The tanks were spaced about 50 yards apart, moving slowly through the rocky terrain. In the middle of the formation, exactly where she had hoped to find them, were the fuel trucks, for large vehicles loaded with thousands of gallons of gasoline and diesel fuel. Her plan was simple in concept, but extremely difficult in execution. She would attack the fuel trucks with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, causing massive explosions that would block the narrow pass and force the column to halt. The resulting chaos would prevent the advance and buy time for friendly forces to organize a defense of San Pietro. But first, she had to get close enough to attack without being shot down by the anti-aircraft guns positioned on the hills overlooking the pass. Sarah banked left and descended even lower, flying barely 50 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, she was hidden from the anti-aircraft guns on the hills, but she was also dangerously close to the ground. One small mistake would send her crashing into the rocks below. The sound of her engine was echoing off the valley walls now, and she knew the enemy would hear her coming soon. But sound traveled slowly compared to her aircraft speed, and she would be on top of them before they could react effectively. As she approached the mouth of the pass, Sarah could see individual soldiers looking up at the sky, try to locate the source of the engine noise they were hearing. Some were pointing weapons in her direction, but they couldn't see her yet through the maze of hills and rocky outcroppings. Sarah checked her armament panel one final time. All 8 machine guns were armed and ready. Her ammunition counter showed full loads of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Everything was prepared for the attack run that would either make history or end her life. The moment of truth was approaching. In 30 seconds, she would emerge from behind the hills and face the full firepower of 35 tanks and their supporting anti-aircraft weapons. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to reconsider. Success or failure would be determined in the next few minutes. Sarah took a deep breath and firmed her grip on the control stick. "Okay, Thunder Girl," she whispered to her aircraft. "Let's go make some history." The moment Sarah emerged from behind the rocky hill, all hell broke loose. The enemy column erupted in a symphony of gunfire as dozens of weapons opened up simultaneously. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive crack of anti-aircraft shells filled the air around her aircraft. She was flying at nearly 300 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the ground, close enough to see the shocked faces of enemy soldiers as Thunder Girl roared overhead. The sheer audacity of a single aircraft attacking such a massive force had caught them completely off guard, but their surprise lasted only seconds before training and instinct took over. Sarah jinked hard left as a stream of machine gun fire tore through the space where her aircraft had been moments before. The P-47's heavy construction absorbed several hits to the wings without affecting flight performance, but she knew that her luck wouldn't hold forever against this volume of fire. The fuel trucks were dead ahead, exactly where intelligence had predicted they would be. 4 large vehicles loaded with enough gasoline to keep the entire column moving for days. Sarah lined up her attack run, fighting to keep the aircraft steady despite the turbulence from exploding shells and the violent evasive maneuvers necessary to avoid the worst of the enemy fire. At 200 yards range, she pressed the trigger. 8 50-caliber machine guns erupted in a thunderous roar that could be heard even over the sound of her engine. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds streaked toward their targets like a river of molten metal, each bullet capable of penetrating steel armor and igniting anything flammable it encountered. The first fuel truck simply disappeared in a massive fireball. The explosion was so violent that it lifted nearby soldiers off their feet and shattered windows in vehicles hundreds of yards away. Secondary explosions followed as burning fuel splashed across other vehicles and ignited their fuel tanks. Sarah pulled up sharply to avoid flying through the mushroom cloud of black smoke and flame that was rising from the destroyed truck. As she climbed, she could see that her attack had been even more successful than she had dared hope. The burning fuel was spreading across the narrow road, creating a wall of fire that would be impossible for the armored vehicles to pass. But she wasn't finished yet. 3 more fuel trucks remained, and the enemy was adapting quickly to her attack. Anti-aircraft guns on the hills were tracking her movement now, sending streams of explosive shells in her direction. She needed to complete her mission before their fire became too accurate to survive. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled the nose down in a diving attack toward the second fuel truck. This maneuver brought her into the concentrated fire of multiple tank cannons, their shells exploding close enough to shake her aircraft violently. A piece of shrapnel punched through her canopy, missing her head by inches and embedding itself in the armor plating behind her seat. The second truck exploded just as spectacularly as the first. This time, Sarah was ready for the explosion and flew around the fireball rather than over it. As she banked hard right to line up on the third target, she caught a glimpse of the chaos her attack was creating in the column below. Tanks were backing up and trying to turn around in the narrow confines of the pass. Several vehicles had collided in the confusion, creating additional roadblocks. Soldiers were running in all directions, some trying to fight the spreading fires while others attempted to clear debris from the road. The third fuel truck was moving now, its driver desperately trying to escape the carnage by driving off the road and across the rough terrain. Sarah adjusted her attack angle to intercept the fleeing vehicle, diving low enough that she could see the terror on the driver's face through the truck's windshield. Her machine gun spoke again, and the truck erupted in another massive explosion. The force of the blast rolled the burning chassis down a steep embankment, where it continued to burn and throw off clouds of black smoke. Only one fuel truck remained, and it was positioned at the rear of the column where the anti-aircraft fire was heaviest. Sarah had been in the air over the target for less than 3 minutes, but those minutes had felt like hours under the intense enemy fire. Her aircraft was showing signs of damage, warning lights flickering on the instrument panel and a slight vibration in the controls that hadn't been there before. But she was committed to completing the mission. The destruction of 3 fuel trucks had severely disrupted the enemy advance, but one remaining truck might be enough to allow them to eventually push through the burning wreckage and continue towards San Pietro. Sarah climbed to 500 feet to get a better view of the tactical situation and plan her final attack run. From this altitude, she could see the full extent of the destruction she had caused. The narrow pass was blocked by burning vehicles and debris. Huge clouds of black smoke were rising into the morning sky, visible for miles in every direction. But she could also see the anti-aircraft guns tracking her movement, their barrels following her flight path with mechanical precision. The gunners were getting her range now, and their shells were exploding closer to her aircraft with each passing second. The fourth fuel truck was parked beside a tank, using the armored vehicle as protection from air attack. This positioning made the truck a difficult target, but Sarah had an idea. Instead of attacking the truck directly, she would attack the tank beside it. If she could disable or destroy the tank, the resulting explosion might be enough to ignite the fuel truck as well. Sarah rolled into a steep dive, pointing the nose of her aircraft directly at the enemy tank. This attack angle brought her into the concentrated fire of every weapon in the rear of the column, and the air around her cockpit filled with tracer rounds and exploding shells. A cannon shell exploded just off her left wing, sending fragments of hot metal through the aircraft's skin. Her left engine oil pressure dropped suddenly, as shrapnel severed a hydraulic line. Another hit shattered her radio, filling the cockpit with sparks and the acrid smell of burning electronics. But Thunder Girl kept flying. The big thunderbolt absorbed the punishment and continued toward its target. Sarah could see her destination growing larger in her gun sight, a medium tank with its main gun pointed upward, trying to track her diving aircraft. At point-blank range, she fired everything she had. 8 machine guns poured nearly 200 rounds into the tank in the space of 2 seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrated the tank's thinner top armor and exploded inside the crew compartment. The tank erupted in a spectacular explosion that sent its turrets spinning through the air like a massive piece of shrapnel. The blast was so powerful that it overturned nearby vehicles and created a crater in the road that would take hours to fill. And as Sarah had hoped, the explosion ignited the 4th fuel truck. The resulting fireball added to the wall of flame and smoke that now completely blocked the mountain pass. No armored vehicle would be able to pass through this inferno for many hours, if ever. Sarah pulled out of her dive just above the valley floor and turned toward home. Her mission was complete. All 4 fuel trucks destroyed, the enemy advance stopped, and San Pietro saved from destruction. But now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Escaping from the valley while her aircraft was damaged and enemy fighters might be scrambling to intercept her. The P-47 was flying differently now. The control stick felt heavy in her hands, and she could feel vibrations through the airframe that indicated structural damage. Her oil pressure was dropping steadily, and several warning lights glowed red on her instrument panel. But the engine was still running, and the controls still responded to her inputs. As she flew down the valley away from the burning column, Sarah could hear radio chatter from enemy forces calling for air support and reporting her attack. She couldn't understand the foreign language, but the urgent tone was unmistakable. Fighter aircraft would be launching soon to hunt for her damaged plane. The weather was deteriorating rapidly as the morning progressed. The clouds she had seen building earlier were now descending into the valleys, reducing visibility and making navigation more difficult. But the same weather that hindered her flight home would also make it harder for enemy fighters to find her. Sarah followed her planned escape route through the mountains, staying low to avoid radar detection and using the terrain to mask her aircraft's radar signature. The damaged P-47 was using more fuel than normal due to the engine problems, and she was becoming concerned about having enough gas to make it back to base. As she flew through a narrow canyon, Sarah spotted enemy aircraft high above the clouds, at least 4 fighters circling the area where she had conducted her attack. They were hunting for her, but so far they hadn't spotted her aircraft flying low through the mountain valleys. The key to survival was staying hidden until she could reach friendly airspace. Sarah reduced power to minimum cruise settings to conserve fuel and reduce her aircraft's heat signature. The P-47 settled into a steady flight pattern that felt almost peaceful after the violence of the past few minutes. But her relief was premature. As she rounded a bend in the valley, Sarah found herself face to face with 2 enemy fighters flying directly toward her. They had been patrolling this valley, waiting for her to use this exact escape route. The enemy pilots were as surprised as she was by the sudden encounter. For a split second, all 3 aircraft flew directly at each other in a deadly game of chicken. Then, training took over and the air battle began. Sarah hauled back on the stick and climbed toward the enemy fighters. In her damaged aircraft, running was not an option. The only way out was through them. Thunder Girl might be hurt, but she still had teeth, and Sarah intended to use them. The dogfight that followed would be talked about in pilot-ready rooms for years to come. A single damaged American fighter against 2 fresh enemy aircraft fought in a narrow mountain valley with limited maneuvering room and deteriorating weather conditions. But that battle and Sarah's ultimate fate would have to wait for another day to be told. The 2 enemy fighters came at Sarah from different angles, their pilots coordinating their attack with practiced precision. These weren't inexperienced rookies fresh from training school. Their formation flying and attack coordination marked them as veteran pilots who had survived many combat encounters. Sarah's damaged P-47 climbed sluggishly compared to its normal performance. The oil pressure was dropping steadily, and she could see dark smoke beginning to stream from beneath the engine cowling. Thunder Girl was hurt badly, but she was still flying and her guns were still functioning. The first enemy fighter opened fire at long range, sending a stream of cannon shells towards Sarah's aircraft. She rolled hard left and pulled into a climbing turn, using every bit of her aircraft's remaining performance to avoid the deadly projectiles. The shells passed close enough that she could hear their distinctive whistle over the sound of her engine. As the first attacker flashed past, the second enemy fighter appeared in her peripheral vision, diving down from above in a perfectly timed attack. Sarah found herself trapped between two opponents who were working together to destroy her. In aerial combat, this was usually a death sentence. But Sarah had advantages that her enemies didn't know about. She had been flying combat missions for 18 months and had survived encounters that had claimed many other pilots. She understood the psychology of aerial combat and knew how to use an opponent's aggression against them. Instead of trying to outrun or outclimb her attackers, Sarah did something unexpected. She chopped the throttle and deployed her flaps, causing Thunder Girl to slow dramatically. The sudden speed reduction caught the diving enemy fighter by surprise, and he overshot her position by several hundred yards before he could adjust. Sarah immediately retracted the flaps and pushed the throttle forward, accelerating toward the first attacker who was coming around for another pass. This aggressive move violated every rule of defensive flying, but it worked perfectly. The enemy pilot had expected her to run, not charge directly at him. At closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, Sarah and the enemy fighter approached each other head-on. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously, filling the air between their aircraft with tracer rounds and explosive shells. This was the most dangerous form of aerial combat, a deadly game of chicken where the pilot with stronger nerves would survive. Sarah held her course steady and kept her finger on the trigger. 850 caliber machine guns poured rounds into the approaching enemy aircraft. She could see her bullets striking the fighter's engine and wings, pieces of metal flying off as the armor-piercing rounds found their mark. The enemy pilot's nerve broke first. He pulled up sharply to avoid the head-on collision, presenting the vulnerable underside of his aircraft to Sarah's guns. She adjusted her aim slightly and continued firing until the enemy fighter rolled over and began trailing smoke and flames. But there was no time to watch her victim crash. The second enemy fighter was diving toward her again, and this pilot had learned from his partner's mistake. Instead of attacking from directly behind, he was coming down at an angle that would be difficult for Sarah to counter. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled the nose down toward the valley floor. This maneuver brought her uncomfortably close to the rocky canyon walls, but it also forced her attacker to follow her into terrain that limited his maneuvering options. The enemy pilot fired as Sarah's aircraft dove toward the rocks below. Cannon shells exploded on the canyon wall, just yards from her wingtip, sending fragments of stones spinning through the air. Sarah pulled out of the dive at the last possible moment, her aircraft's belly almost scraping the canyon floor. The extreme maneuver put tremendous stress on Thunder Girl's already damaged airframe. Sarah heard something crack in the wing structure, and her left aileron began responding sluggishly to control inputs. The P-47 was falling apart around her, but she was still alive and still fighting. The enemy pilot had followed her down into the canyon, but his aircraft was designed for high-altitude performance and didn't handle well in the thick air near the ground. Sarah used this to her advantage, pulling into a tight climbing turn that her opponent couldn't match without stalling his engine. As the enemy fighter struggled to follow her maneuver, Sarah reversed direction and dove back down toward him. This put her in the perfect position for a deflection shot, firing at an angle to intercept the enemy aircraft's flight path rather than chasing behind him. Her machine guns chattered for 3 seconds, sending nearly 100 rounds into the enemy fighter's cockpit and engine compartment. The aircraft immediately began losing altitude and trailing a thick stream of black smoke. Sarah watched as it crashed into the canyon wall in a spectacular explosion that echoed off the surrounding rocks. Suddenly, the mountain valley was quiet except for the sound of Thunder Girl's laboring engine. Both enemy fighters had been destroyed, but Sarah's aircraft was in terrible condition. Oil pressure was nearly zero, engine temperature was climbing rapidly, and the control stick felt like it was connected to the control surfaces with rubber bands. Sarah climbed out of the canyon and headed toward home, but she knew that time was running out. The engine was dying slowly, and without oil pressure, it would seize up completely within minutes. She needed to find a place to land before Thunder Girl fell out of the sky. The weather was getting worse by the minute. Clouds were descending into the valleys, reducing visibility to just a few hundred yards in some areas. Rain was beginning to fall, making the mountain peaks disappear into gray mist. Flying in these conditions with a damaged aircraft was extremely dangerous, but Sarah had no choice except to continue. As she flew through the deteriorating weather, Sarah thought about the mission she had just completed. 4 fuel trucks destroyed, an entire armored column stopped in its tracks, and thousands of civilian lives saved. It had been worth the risk, even if she didn't survive to see the results. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. The P-47 had a reputation for bringing damaged pilots home, and Thunder Girl had saved her life many times before. If the engine could hold together for just a few more minutes, she might be able to reach friendly territory where rescue was possible. The oil pressure gauge finally dropped to 0, and the engine temperature climbed into the red zone. Sarah could smell burning oil and hear unusual sounds from the engine compartment. Thunder Girl was dying, but she was still flying. Through a break in the clouds, Sarah spotted something that made her heart leap with hope. In a narrow valley ahead, she could see the straight lines and geometric patterns that indicated an airfield. It was small and probably abandoned, but the runway looked long enough and clear enough for an emergency landing. Sarah turned toward the airfield and began setting up for an approach. Without engine power, she would have only one chance to get this right. The P-47 would glide like a brick once the engine quit completely, and there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. As she approached the airfield, Sarah could see that it was indeed abandoned. Weeds grew through cracks in the runway, and several damaged aircraft sat beside empty hangars. But the main runway appeared to be in decent condition, and it was pointed directly into the wind. The engine finally seized with a grinding noise that Sarah felt through the entire airframe. Thunder Girl was now a glider, albeit a very heavy and poorly designed one. Sarah had perhaps 2 minutes of gliding flight remaining before physics would force her to the ground. She lowered the landing gear and flaps, configuring the aircraft for the slowest possible approach speed. Without engine power, she couldn't afford to come in too fast and run off the end of the runway. But she also couldn't afford to come in too slow and stall short of the runway. The approach felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably less than a minute from engine failure to touchdown. Sarah held the aircraft in a steady glide, trading altitude for airspeed and adjusting her flight path to line up with the runway centerline. Thunder Girl touched down hard, her landing gear absorbing the impact with groaning protests from the damaged airframe. Sarah stood on the brakes as the heavy fighter rolled down the abandoned runway, finally coming to a stop less than 100 yards from the end of the pavement. For a long moment, Sarah sat in the cockpit, breathing heavily and listening to the sounds of cooling metal and dripping oil. She was alive, Thunder Girl was on the ground, and the mission had been completed successfully. It was more than she had dared hope for when she took off that morning. As she climbed out of the cockpit and stood on solid ground for the first time in several hours, Sarah could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines. Friendly aircraft, she hoped, coming to investigate the unknown aircraft that had just landed at the abandoned airfield. She looked back at Thunder Girl, taking in the extent of the damage for the first time. The aircraft was riddled with holes from enemy gunfire. One wing had a crack running from the landing gear to the wing root. The engine cowling was black with oil and showed several large holes where cannon shells had penetrated. It was a miracle that the aircraft had continued flying as long as it had. The P-47's reputation for toughness was well-deserved, and Thunder Girl had proven it once again by bringing her pilot home against all odds. As the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, Sarah began preparing to signal her identity to prevent being mistaken for an enemy pilot. But first, she wanted to send a radio message to let her squadron know that she was alive and that the mission had been successful. She climbed back into the cockpit and tried the radio, but only static came from the damaged equipment. The radio had been destroyed during the dogfight, leaving her with no way to communicate with friendly forces. The approaching aircraft were visible now through the broken clouds. 2 P-51 Mustangs flying a search pattern over the valley. Sarah climbed on a Thunder Girl's wing and began waving her arms to attract their attention. After a few minutes, one of the Mustangs broke off and made a low pass over the airfield. Sarah could see the pilot looking down at her, and at the damaged P-47. The Mustang pilot waggled his wings in recognition and then flew off to report her location. Within an hour, a rescue helicopter arrived to pick her up and take her back to base. As the helicopter lifted off from the abandoned airfield, Sarah took one last look at Thunder Girl sitting alone on the broken runway. The aircraft had served her faithfully through many dangerous missions, and this final flight would be remembered as the most important of them all. But the real test of the mission's success wouldn't be known until reports came in about the enemy armored column. Had her attack really stopped their advance towards San Pietro? Were the civilians safe? Those questions would be answered in the coming hours and days. The helicopter touched down at the base hospital instead of the airfield, despite Sarah's protests that she was uninjured. The flight surgeon, Major Roberts, was waiting with a team of medics who immediately began checking her for injuries that adrenaline might have masked during the combat mission. "I'm fine, Doc," Sarah insisted as they helped her out of the helicopter. "Just some cuts from flying glass when my canopy got hit. Nothing serious." Major Roberts ignored her protests and began his examination anyway. After 18 months of treating combat pilots, he had learned that many injuries didn't become apparent until hours after a mission when the body's natural shock response wore off. "You've got a nasty cut on your forehead that needs stitches," he said after completing his examination, "and some bruised ribs from the G-forces during those extreme maneuvers. Nothing life-threatening, but you're grounded for at least 48 hours. As the medical team cleaned and bandaged her wounds, Sarah's thoughts turned to the mission results. She had destroyed the fuel trucks and caused massive chaos in the enemy column, but she wouldn't know the full impact until intelligence reports came in from reconnaissance aircraft and ground observers. Colonel Harrison arrived at the hospital just as the medics were finishing their work. His face showed a mixture of relief and amazement as he approached Sarah's bed. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, then broke into a grin. "That was either the craziest or the most brilliant piece of flying I've seen in this war. Probably both. Did it work, sir? Did we stop them?" Colonel Harrison's grin widened. "Oh, it worked all right. Reconnaissance reports indicate that the enemy column is completely blocked in the mountain pass. They've got burning vehicles and debris scattered over nearly a mile of road. Some of the tanks are trying to turn around and retreat, but they're stuck behind the wreckage." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The mission had succeeded. San Pietro was safe, at least for now. But that's not the best part, Colonel Harrison continued. "The intelligence boys have been monitoring enemy radio traffic all morning. Apparently, your little one-plane air show caused such panic that they've called off 2 other offensive operations to deal with what they think is a major Allied breakthrough. The implications were staggering. A single pilot attacking an impossible target had not only saved one town, but had disrupted enemy operations across the entire theater. The psychological impact of the attack was proving to be even more valuable than the physical destruction. Over the next several hours, Reports continued to arrive that painted a picture of complete success. The enemy armored column was trapped in the mountain pass and would remain there for at least 48 hours while engineers tried to clear the wreckage. During that time, Allied ground forces were moving into defensive positions that would make any future attack much more difficult. More importantly, the enemy high command was convinced that the attack represented the beginning of a major Allied offensive. They were pulling troops from other sectors to reinforce the area around the mountain pass, weakening their defenses elsewhere along the front lines. By evening, word of Sarah's mission had spread throughout the base and beyond. Pilots from other squadrons stopped by the hospital to shake her hand and hear the story firsthand. Ground crews who had serviced her aircraft wanted to know how Thunder Girl had performed during the impossible mission. The attention was overwhelming and somewhat embarrassing. Sarah had always been a team player who preferred to let her flying do the talking. Being treated like a celebrity made her uncomfortable. But she understood that the story of the mission would be important for morale throughout the theater. Lieutenant Baker, her young squadron mate from Oklahoma, visited that evening with news from the airfield. "They've already sent a recovery team to bring Thunder Girl back," he reported. "Master Sergeant Johnson says the old bird is shot to pieces, but the main structure is intact. They think they can rebuild her good as new." Sarah was pleased to hear that her aircraft might fly again. The P-47 had saved her life during the mission, and she felt a personal attachment to the machine that had carried her through so many dangerous encounters. "There's something else," Baker continued. "Word came down from division headquarters. You're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and there's talk of something even higher. Congressional Medal of Honor level stuff." Sarah was stunned. She had never flown for medals or recognition. The mission had been necessary to save civilian lives, and she had simply done what needed to be done. "I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, destroying 35 tanks with one airplane isn't anyone's job. That's something special." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's hospital room. General Morrison, the theater commander, arrived unannounced and without the usual entourage of staff officers that normally accompanied high-ranking visitors. "Captain Mitchell," he said simply, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday." Sarah started to stand, but the general waved her back to her bed. "I've been fighting this war for 3 years," he continued, "and I've seen a lot of brave pilots do incredible things. But what you accomplished yesterday will be studied in military academies for decades to come. A single aircraft attack that stopped an entire armored division and disrupted enemy operations across a 100-mile front." General Morrison pulled up a chair and sat down beside Sarah's bed, his manner becoming less formal. "I want you to understand something, Captain. This war is going to end eventually, and when it does, people are going to ask what made the difference. What turned the tide? There will be many answers: industrial production, technological advances, superior logistics. But sometimes it comes down to individual courage and skill. Yesterday, you made a difference that thousands of people will never even know about." The general stood up and straightened his uniform. "I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor," he said formally. "And I'm also recommending you for immediate promotion to Major. The Air Force needs leaders who understand that impossible missions are just another day at the office." After the general left, Sarah sat quietly in her hospital bed thinking about his words. She had always known that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, but she was beginning to understand the true scope of what she had accomplished. The mission had started as a desperate attempt to save one town from destruction. It had evolved into something much larger, a strategic victory that would affect the course of the war in this theater. The psychological impact on enemy forces was proving to be even more valuable than the physical destruction of their equipment. That afternoon, Sarah received her first letter from home since the mission. Her brother Tommy had somehow heard about her attack through military channels and had written from his position in the Pacific. "Sis," his letter began, "the word over here is that you've been raising hell with the enemy in your corner of the world. I always knew you were tougher than me, but taking on 35 tanks by yourself is showing off just a little bit, don't you think? The letter continued with news from home and updates on his own unit's activities, but Sarah focused on one paragraph near the end. I've been thinking about what you wrote in your last letter about doing what needs to be done even when the odds are impossible. Yesterday proved that you understand what that really means. You make me proud to be your brother, and you make all of us proud to wear the same uniform. Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Tommy's words meant more to her than any medal or promotion. The approval of fellow warriors who understood the cost of courage was the only recognition that truly mattered. 2 days later, Sarah was released from the hospital and returned to active duty. Her first stop was the hangar where Thunder Girl was being repaired. Master Sergeant Johnson and his crew had been working around the clock to rebuild the damaged aircraft. She'll be ready to fly again in about a week, Johnson reported. We've had to replace most of the engine, patch about 200 holes in the fuselage and wings, and rebuild the entire control system. But the basic airframe is sound. This old bird is too tough to kill. Sarah walked around the aircraft, examining the extent of the repairs. It was hard to believe that she had flown home in a machine that was this badly damaged. The P-47's reputation for toughness was legendary, but Thunder Girl had exceeded even those standards. Sergeant Johnson, she said as she completed her inspection, I want you to add something to the nose art when you repaint her. What's that, Captain? Sarah smiled. 35 tank silhouettes. I think Thunder Girl has earned the right to show off a little bit. As Sarah walked away from the hangar, she thought about the future. The war would continue. There would be more missions, more dangerous assignments, more impossible challenges. But she had learned something important during that flight through the mountain pass. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for untried. Sometimes the experts who said something couldn't be done simply lacked the imagination to see a different approach. And sometimes a single pilot with the right aircraft and the courage to attempt the unthinkable could change the course of history. The mission that everyone said was impossible had become the most important 3 hours of Sarah's life. It had saved thousands of civilian lives, disrupted enemy operations across an entire theater, and proved that individual courage could still make a difference in modern warfare. But most importantly, it had shown that when someone claims no pilot could do that, they might just be talking to the wrong pilot. Thunder Girl would fly again, and so would Captain Sarah Mitchell. The war was far from over, and there would be many more opportunities to prove that impossible was just another word for challenging. In the months that followed, the story of the lone pilot who destroyed 35 tanks would spread throughout Allied forces around the world. It would become a symbol of individual courage, triumphing over impossible odds, inspiring countless other airmen to attempt missions that conventional wisdom said couldn't be done. But for Sarah, the most important result was much simpler. 3,000 civilians in San Pietro were alive because one pilot had been willing to risk everything to protect people she had never met. In the end, that was what made all the danger and sacrifice worthwhile. The impossible mission had become possible through skill, courage, and determination. And Thunder Girl's guns had proven that sometimes the experts are wrong about what can't be done.